Hey y'all, did you know that the flag of the United States of America features 50 white stars? Those stars ain't just for decoration or design, they represent the number of states of America. Each of those 50 states used to be its own separate country back in the day. Take Texas, for instance. It's a whopping 700,000 square kilometers, bigger than France by a long shot, and twice the size of all of Germany. It's even 5 times larger than England. Back in the day, each state had its own laws, legislatures, cultures, and even different races living together. So, how did these states decide to band together under one nation? And who managed to convince them to do it? Welcome guys, I'm Adam Carter, but before we dive in, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit subscribe and ring that bell to get notified of our videos. Now, the history of the American land stretches back thousands of years. This land was home to a diverse group of peoples that indigenous people considered the first inhabitants of the American continent. They migrated from other continents to America via a land bridge between Asia and America. However, over time, that bridge disappeared due to melting ice and rising sea levels. Nonetheless, people here kept on living in peace, building communities, cities, and civilizations, until the day Italian explorer Christopher Columbus stumbled upon the Americas on his ship, lost in 1492. After that, Europeans were completely captivated by the New World, especially since the indigenous populations were relatively simple people without much to defend themselves, and thus began the era of colonization. Every European country with some money sent ships to America and established some colonies there. Spain and Portugal set up colonies in the south. France established colonies in the east. And even the Dutch and Swedes made some small colonies. But the big player was Britain. They colonized the entire East Coast. We're just getting started on this wild ride through American history. Even though Britain was one of the last countries to establish colonies in America, they ended up controlling the whole darn place. The first permanent English colony in America was Virginia, established in 1607. As the number of immigrants increased, so did the number of slaves, and the colonies expanded and grew bigger and bigger until they reached 13 English colonies along the American coast. These 13 colonies were divided into 3 parts. The New England colonies, including New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. The Middle colonies, which included New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And finally, the Southern colonies, consisting of Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. Each colony had a governor appointed directly from London, responsible for managing the colony and enforcing laws. And of course, tax collection. Now, France still had many colonies in America, and due to ongoing conflicts between Britain and France, British forces clashed with French forces and managed to kick them out of most of their colonies, focusing heavily on this part of the world, because we're going to need it in a bit. Yep, Britain kicked out France and took over their colonies. But these wars left Britain economically exhausted. Because of the economic crisis, they slapped on a ton of taxes on the people living in American colonies. In 1765, the British Parliament passed a law called the Stamp Act, imposing hefty taxes on the residents of their colonies in America. Not only that, but the prices of goods exported to them via ships skyrocketed. For the first time, delegates from every colony gathered to outright reject these British decisions and insisted on sending a message to the King and Parliament of Britain, demanding a tax reduction. But, of course, no one listened. So they decided to boycott the goods coming from Britain. However, because the merchants and factory owners back in Britain had their interests at stake, they pressured Parliament to repeal the law. And indeed, the law was repealed in 1766, just a year later, and things settled down a bit, till Britain imposed new regulations and taxes again. The Americans began staging protests, until eventually the Americans said to the British government, "Fine, impose taxes on us as you wish." but in return, give us representatives in Parliament so they can voice our concerns. Because at that time, the residents of the colonies had no voice in Parliament, as if they didn't even exist. Of course, the British government rejected their request and increased taxes on them again. As a result, the residents of the colonies began to express their anger significantly until an event occurred in December 1773. 3 ships loaded with goods were docked in the harbor of the city of Boston. A group of settlers boarded the ships, destroyed the goods, and tossed them into the sea. The event was daring, and it inspired other residents of the second colonies to express their anger against the British government, especially since the population of the colonies had significantly increased by then. You can imagine that from 1625 to 1775, the population of the colonies increased from 2,000 people to 2.25 million after the incident with the goods in the port of Boston. Britain sent troops to the area and dealt with the settlers very harshly. This made the residents of the other colonies very annoyed with the government. Consequently, meetings were held among them to consult and think about what they could do and how they could act against the injustice and oppression from Britain. These meetings between the delegates of the colonies created a sense of common identity among them. They felt for the first time that they could make decisions on their own without having to return to the British government. This was the point at which a new dream emerged. Why shouldn't we declare independence from Britain and become our own country? And indeed, the 13 colonies united and established their own parliament, called the Continental Congress. They laid down a set of regulations, including the end of slavery in America and the declaration that anyone present on American soil is an American citizen with rights. They declared their independence on July 4, 1776, and since then, America has celebrated it until this day as Independence Day. They wrote a document containing the text of the Declaration of Independence and distributed it among the residents of the colonies. One of the most famous sentences in this declaration: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Of course, the story doesn't end there. It won't be that easy. After declaring independence, Britain immediately sent its army to America, and a war broke out between British soldiers and the American residents for 8 continuous years. Britain's goal was to divide the 13 colonies from each other, but at the beginning of the war, a very strange event occurred. The Americans besieged the British forces in the Saratoga area of New York. When the British general approached defeat, he surrendered and signed an agreement known as the Saratoga Agreement to release his soldiers. This event marked a significant turning point in the war. European countries began to realize that Americans actually had significant power. This encouraged the Americans to play a sneaky game. They asked for support from Britain's enemies, such as France. As we mentioned earlier, Britain had expelled France from most of their colonies. The Americans used this point and went to France, asking for help in their war against Britain. Indeed, France responded, and so did the Netherlands and Spain. They assisted in the war against Britain, not out of love for the Americans, but as revenge against the British. The war indeed achieved great success, especially because among the Americans was a skilled military general, George Washington. He was responsible for organizing and managing military movements. The situation continued like this until Britain realized that they were losing a lot in the war without gaining anything. That's why in 1783, the Americans succeeded in gaining independence, and the war ended. The United States of America became an independent country. The 13 colonies that declared independence were just a part of the story. Where did the other 50 states come from? After France helped the Americans in the war, they said, "We don't want your land. Do you want to buy it?" The American colonies agreed and indeed bought their territories for $15 million. America's territory doubled shortly afterward. Russia also had a piece, Alaska, which they sold to the Americans for $7.2 million when the financial situation was bad in Russia. In the mid-19th century, another significant event occurred. There was a large region called Texas, which was ruled by Spain, France, and Mexico. After some wars, Texas declared independence from these colonial powers, and immediately joined the United States. Then, there was a war between Mexico and America took another piece of land from them. In 1898, there was a war between Spain and America, and again, America took some islands from them. Eventually, the number of states in the American Union reached 50, and now you can see the United States of America on the map of the world. If you'd like to learn about any specific topic, feel free to leave a comment. The upcoming episodes will be based on your suggestions from comments.